Awesome. Okay. Thanks all for coming. I mean, honestly, incredible panel, like the combined experience of this group. I knew, just giving a little context for this panel itself, it's called building DAOs as functioning organizations, which I feel everyone smirking, laughing right now. But the main thing I knew I wanted to do was bring together a panel that is very practical, like from the people who are actually building actively, and not just like an investor or someone who's doing research, but actually on the ground and building it. So I'm super happy and like lucky that you guys all agreed to join us. And another thing that I want to mention is that we're actually going to do this panel a little bit differently because it is kind of a longer panel. So I feel, I assume most of you guys are here because you guys are building DAOs or thinking about building DAOs itself in some form. And so I want to open the floor up in the beginning for people to just like mention something, a topic you want to talk about, a burning question you have, something like that. And then we're going to weave that into the panel itself. And then we'll do that halfway as well. So you guys will have another chance if you guys want someone to expand on a topic or things like that. So I want it to be super useful for the people who are present and here. And so don't be shy about bringing up the topics you guys want to discuss. So further ado, we're going to allow the speakers to introduce yourself, your name, your organization, any relevant organizations you're part of, as well as just briefly, like what is a value or a core belief you have as someone who's building in this space that has kind of carried you through building in general. Maybe we can go with Justine first.
Okay. Am I doing this right?
Yeah, is this right? Yeah.
I'm Justine. I'm the governance lead at Optimism. I used to be part of a bunch of other DAOs. I stopped doing all of the other stuff so I could focus on Optimism. A core belief, the thing I think is interesting about Optimism is I don't think that we can execute on the optimistic vision without a DAO. And that's because we need to do that. We need a capture-resistant network and the governance of that network, and we need credibly neutral allocation of capital to do the retroactive public goods funding. So I think that is somewhat unique about Optimism, is that you can't really take the DAO out of it, or you can't do the thing.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm the governance lead at RadWorks, which is the now new name for the Radical DAO. So we used to be Abby from Radical, and now I'm Abby from RadWorks. And RadWorks is, again, like the new name for the Radical DAO, but RadWorks is basically a community-governed network that funds new, resilient, and permissionless technologies to cultivate internet freedom. That's our hot new one-liner purpose statement. And so I actually share the same core belief. That's actually exactly what I was going to say in terms of capture resistance, credible neutrality, and decentralized governance being like the way to actually create organizations that have those attributes. But more so, I think that the development of open source technology and the development of resilient and permissionless technologies that also ensure capture resistance and credible neutrality should also be governed in a censorship resistant and credible neutrality way. So it's like, governing the infrastructure that has these qualities in a way that also withholds the values of the technology itself. So it's kind of this like recursive aspect to it. So that's kind of like a core belief, is that we actually, similar to how we need to build free software with free software, and that being like such like an important aspect of the free software movement, we kind of have to exhibit that as well when we're building decentralized technologies. So.
Do I have to hold something?
I have no idea. I'm just going to talk into it the whole time.
Very, very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Amy, for inviting me here. My name is Maria Gomez. I started working with DAOs back in 2017 in a project called Aragon. I was one of the first hires. I stayed with that project for 4 years, more or less. And currently, I'm the managing director of the Interchain Foundation. It's the foundation adjacent to the many blockchains, or for what for me are DAOs, and this is going to be a point of discussion here. This foundation that is adjacent to many blockchains that form the Cosmos network or the interchain network. And my values, why I'm here, is like, for me, these new systems, these blockchains, these what are, for me, decentralized and autonomous organizations, are like these innovative type of systems that are censorship resistant, of course, and legal. They don't abide to any specific jurisdiction. It's very hard to really regulate them because they are more close to a machine than to a typical organization. They are free and they are open to anybody to audit the code. That's the type of thing that brought me to work in crypto. I truly believe that these type of new entities are, we never had that before. And so, yeah, I think the world needs these systems.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up now to the floor. So if anyone wants to just like bring up a topic or a burning question that they want to hear in this panel, just because when you think about building an organization, there's so many layers to it, right? There's like onboarding, there is the development of like power and influence balancing, the org structure itself, across so many governance, design, etc. So I want to just make sure it's relevant to you guys. And so does anyone want to bring up something that they've been thinking about? And then, we're not going to answer exactly right now. It'll weave into the panel.
Nice. Yeah, so I won't phrase it as a question, just maybe a topic to cover, but through the primitives that are emerging with DAOs, whether it's ownership, governance, power, as you mentioned, influence, and behaviors, what are things that have worked well in silos or in kind of wider networks, and what could work because of a use case or a new permutation of how we collectively organize? Just to see that like current and future outlook would help.
What is the level of granularity you think we should push to the community to decide on? I think right now we like pushing everything to the community, and like personal opinion, I think that's not maybe the best. For you, you're governing infrastructure, so maybe view on infrastructure governance, but as well on application layer governance, because it might be a little bit different from your opinion.
Hey, so assuming that building in public also means letting community members on board and participate in the building of whatever's been made, how do you ensure quality in the people who are onboarded to help build in public in a way that contributes to a successful product or whatever the mission is?
So the question exactly in mind. Anybody else? Scott? Yeah.
So you three or four are probably like true DAO believers like me. In this environment, there's like a lot of people seem to kind of be giving up on DAOs, and like you see things moving more centralized. And the principles which you said what a DAOs allow, and like building unstoppable products and unstoppable networks, we haven't had many cases where like people are attacking these things. So it doesn't matter if it's unstoppable, but it will matter when it only matters when it matters. So how do you keep pushing everyone to like do the decentralized path instead of the centralized path? Because everyone's keeps going back to the centralized path. Yeah.
And on top of that, how do you incentivize participation when everything is hyper-financialized?
These are all so great. Yeah. Is there something you guys want to actively?
All those questions?
I don't know what's going on. Where do you
It's like anyway. Yeah.
Anyway.
1.5 hours is a long time. We could literally.
I know we could. Yeah, it is true. Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, where do you want to start?
I think something that we've been talking a lot about is this balance of power and an influence, and so a lot of the design around governance or around the organization itself is around how do we balance the responsibilities of the DAO or multiple parts of the organization. I'm curious, you just did your transition into the DAO with Radical. If maybe you want to start with your experience there. Yeah.
So I think that actually this has become like a a core, I guess you could say, like DAO operational belief, mainly from our conversation that we had in Denver, like maybe a year ago now or something. No way, that's crazy. But that power and influence are different and they need to be modeled differently. And right now we have this like hyper financialization in which power and influence are kind of like baked in with each other. And there's actually no way to separate the two. And so what you see is you have people who have undue influence also having undue power, which creates like massive centralization sinks within DAOs, right? And it also creates conditions in which the only way to distribute influence is by distributing power, which then creates the hyper-financialization. And that if you want someone to have more votes, then you send them more tokens. But now they just have, more tokens. And then, of course, they're going to sell tokens. And, so because it has maybe it has more of a financial incentive, which outweighs their participatory incentive. So there's a lot of big issues, I think, in DAOs right now and how we're modeling power and influence and actually separating them, which is something that, for example, so I also am on the board of the Optimism Foundation, and the reason why I was so excited to join that is specifically because how Optimism is experimenting with separating power and influence with the citizen house, with the token house, with the bicameral governance structure that they're designing, but also within RadWorks of saying, like, how can we, instead of just saying power is financialized and the only way to distribute influence is by distributing power, how can we split the two and start creating more localized decision making that has different mechanisms of distributing influence so that you can intentionally distribute influence within a system that balances the current power that you have. And so I think that a trend that we're going to start seeing is, like, of course you have people who are saying, okay, this decentralization path isn't for me, this centralized path is this is the way that people need to function. I actually think that the more exciting path is to say, what's really great about what we have right now is that we have really great battle-tested on-chain governance mechanisms, right? We have token voting, and actually token voting works. It's like the only Sybil-resistant governance mechanism we have that can govern millions and millions and millions of dollars in a relatively secure way. That's an awesome mechanism, but how can we pair that with really strong off-chain governance mechanisms that create alternative distributions of influence that can balance the power that we have that exists within token voting systems, whether that's bicameral governance systems, whether that's reputation models within DAOs that equate to power. And so with our recent transition, in which we transitioned all of our development, so everybody who was paid by the Radical Foundation now is paid via what was known as the Radical DAO, which is RadWorks Treasury, via governance. And so now the community is in complete control over how the technologies in our ecosystem are being funded. And now what comes after that transition is saying, okay, well, who are the stakeholders that can make those decisions in the best way possible, and how can we now distribute influence to them within the current system instead of going back to the drawing board? It's saying we have a really great secure system that's battle tested and that works. That's awesome. How can we start introducing better off-chain mechanisms to support stakeholders to make better decisions together? Because that was my hot take, that, by the way, is that I hate DAOs. I don't like the term DAO. I want to move away from it. DAOs are everybody just prescribes their own expectations and their own values to it and has their own image of it and say, oh, that, who are we to say that's a DAO, that's not a DAO? DAOs are just groups of people making decisions together with a purpose that use different coordination mechanisms, right? And so I think that if we separate power and influence, we can start looking at our groups of people that we're in and start figuring out how to just empower them to make decisions better while retaining the good aspects that we have of DAOs right now, which is really battle-tested, on-chain mechanisms. Long-winded answer, sorry.
I want to actually expand on the comment that we were talking about, the power and influence. So I would describe power as sort of this kind of hard, decision, right? So you can veto something, you have the power, having tokens and being oh, actually, we're going to make the final say. That's power. But often founders, early people in the teams, token people, with the airdrop, trying to do a distribution of that power. But influence is that you can have no power. So you see this in teams that are working as experts on something, right? And they're delivering something, and they have influence where the people say, oh, they actually know about risk. For example, at MakerDAO, it's the risk team. We trust that you have expertise in this topic, and you have influence, but they might not be the biggest token holders. So maybe in the end, they're not making these decisions at the end. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, this difference between the power and influence. And if you're a founder, maybe you have both because you've been in the project really long. And so with that, I wanted to hand it off to Justine to talk about sort of the optimism and how you guys have thought about going back to that question about community and pushing everything to community, but like how you distribute some of these responsibilities and then create a structure that allows you to have that.
Yeah. Yeah, so sorry, I'm getting sidetracked by, it's interesting to think about power and influence different. I think hard power is easier to deal with because you can see it and you can quantify it and you can point to it, so you can hold it more accountable. Influence is like more problematic. I really want someone to do research on like collusion in DAOs. I think we need better metrics for understanding the distribution of power and influence. We look at like Gini coefficient and like Nakamoto coefficient, right? So how many delegates do I need to have 51% vote? But what really matters is the propensity for those delegates to collude. Or you have like VCs that delegate to like 10 different delegates. That's all one interest, right? That's like, that can be like a voting block in a way. So I'm going on a tangent, but I think that influence is the harder one to deal with. Power exists in DAOs, and so do leaders, and so we should just define them so that we can, you can identify who's accountable and then hold them accountable. We shy away from doing that because we don't like the idea that these things exist, but we're humans, like they exist. And so if we can make them transparent, then we can like do something about it. So this is a tirade. Sorry.
No.
This is not the question you asked me. But
yeah, this is
okay.
I feel like we're all very jaded. yeah. Maybe Maria, this is the way you want to add something
about power and influence.
Yeah.
And that question is very difficult, especially depending on what system are you thinking about. Like, is a proof of work? Or is it proof of stake? Like in now Ethereum, but like in Cosmos, right? So we are like looking at that power of influence in Cosmos and in Cosmos Change, and about the role of the validators. Because they have a lot of stake. That means they are very powerful, but also some we are seeing that also some of the smaller validators, they do have influence, and within the system, there must be check and balances. So that's how you can play with that. How you limit a specific power that is very declared, who checks that specific power of the specific group, and in the, for example, in the Cosmos Change, and the validators, that's the token holders and the community, because we can, if we are not in agreement with how they are going to vote in certain specific cases, we are able to override their vote. So the power and influence thing is a really very interesting game that you can think about different mechanisms, off chain and on chain mechanisms, in order to balance those.
And does anyone give an example that you've seen where there is a mechanism that is sort of balancing this? Maybe it's doing this influence like with Otter Space or badges or things like that. Does anyone have an example?
I can talk about our two-house system, if that makes sense. So for those of you who don't know, Optimism is actually two DAOs. We call it two houses. It's basically two DAOs, and one is token-weighted. It's plutocratic. It's like the DAOs you think of when you think of DAOs, and then the other one is one member, one vote. And we've designed a voting structure where different houses have different governance rights, and the other house, in some cases, has a veto right. And so the intention behind this is, well, it's like I could go on for hours about this. I gave a talk on Thursday about more details. But one is to match the type of decision that we think the voting structure is best suited towards. So there are some instances, like in economically driven decisions, where maybe plutocracy makes sense. And then there are other instances, like allocating like RPGF funding, where a one member, one vote model is probably better. And so we've designed a system where, let's say, the token house can make a proposal that's economically driven, but the citizens house can veto it. And so in that way, you're always creating this check on any imbalance that's happening in the voting distribution in the token weighted house.
Yeah, I think that I think the way that optimism is doing it is saying at its base layer, you're having the different mechanisms working together, right? And I think another approach, instead of designing like the deepest layer of the stack, building in the powers, you can still have a system that has kind of like just token voting at the top. And another way to distribute influence and to distribute power is to, I say this all the time, but to create more localized decision-making centers within the organization itself. So like a really good example of this that's actually not in crypto is the way that I think it's like electric co-ops are organized in the States. I watched this lecture from this guy, Keith Taylor, who spoke about it at length, and I won't do it as well as him. But the point is that like most of the like electrical infrastructure in the States is organized in cooperatives that are localized, so state by state or county by county even, but are interconnected in these like polycentric hierarchies. So that each co-op is a part of has a representative that goes to the council of the state or something like this, right? And so basically there's like these tiers of hierarchies, but it's not just one linear hierarchy. And this is my other hot take, that actually hierarchies are not inherently evil. It's when there's a power imbalance in hierarchies that's because it's a static linear system that's not transparent and doesn't have any room for actually shifting power, is when hierarchies are bad. Because you don't know how the hierarchies are set. You don't know how the power, you know how like you're distributed the power and there's no way to change it and there's no way to like voice. But actually hierarchies that are intertwined, that are polycentric, that are transparent and have like really effective voice mechanisms in which leadership and power can be exchanged fluidly, is actually a really healthy, resilient system, because what you have happening is localized decision making, which reduces the surface area of decision making for everybody, which means that the people who are best at making the decisions can be making the decisions. You have a clear way to exchange power, clear election process, so people can exchange power. You have like leadership and everything. And then you have distributed influence. So what you have is actually like a more diverse system of participants with, sure, maybe more centralized centers, but a larger network of centralized centers that are within the greater system itself. And so this is actually the approach that we're taking with RadWorks, which is like, instead of trying to say, okay, let's now have a bicameral system, it's saying, no, you know what, our treasury should be governed by token voting for right now. It works. This is a great way to manage our treasury. But now let's experiment with how we can take power and delegate it to more localized decision-making centers and build off-chain mechanisms around that delegation, right? So we're exploring what it means. What if, the top 10 token holders of our DAO are not individuals like this traditional protocol delegate model? What if there are other DAOs, and then those DAOs have their own independent decision-making centers where they make decisions within our DAO in their own way? And then how could we delegate power through the DAO? How could token holders delegate power to these individual centers so that they can act as participants in the system with this delegated influence base, this delegated power, which is influence? And so experimenting with how you can create these substructures and these natural hierarchies that are all kind of fluid, I think is like a really great way to build a more resilient decentralized governance, network without having to go all the way back and to the drawing board and design like a whole new, basically, political system.
Yeah, Synthetics was like early in doing this idea of these councils, and then the councils they have domains they make decisions over, but they're, I believe, like simple majority. So you're having like an aspect within the token-weighted DAO that's not a token-weighted decision-making mechanism.
Synthetics governance is so underrated. Like I don't know if anybody's like really dove into it. They were so early.
It's like 2019.
Yeah, like right after Maker, Synthetics came and they just started doing it like super like under the radar, and their council system like works. It actually functions and they make decisions, and they've also had exchange of leadership. They've had like a lot of really important conversations about power, like with Kane or like some of like the founders and everything. And it's really impressive because that's basically what they're doing. So they're just creating like these like networked hierarchies that are all like interoperating with each other.
Yeah, I was going to say, I want to touch back on this idea of leadership And I think we have this conversation in DAOs a lot where there's like, say that it's decentralized, but there's clearly someone who's like running it or kind of leading with their ideas or part of the influence part. I'm curious what you guys think, what kind of leaders do we need in the space? And how have you seen in either your organization or outside of your organization the development of those leaders?
I just agree totally with what Abby said about like leadership is fine so long as it's fluid, right? So it's not, the hierarchy is not entrenched and the leadership can change, and you don't just have one. I think when we think about like foundation, transition into DAO, et cetera, and what kind of like qualities the leader needs and how that differs, and if you're in like a labs or a foundation or the DAO, it's like much more about, I think, vision setting. So like, where do we want to go? And then it's up to the DAO to figure out kind of like how we get there specifically, right? Some people talk about this, like create the container, and then the DAO does things within that container. It's like influence. You don't have positional authority. You can't tell people what to do, but you have a high degree of influence generally if you're the core team. I think you need to be like really low ego for everyone who's worked in a DAO every day. Like the ego's gotta go. I'm curious what you would add.
I don't have the right answer, but I can give you an example, for example, of lack of leadership and how that presents a problem right now that we are dealing with it at the Interchain Foundation. So the foundation, what we do is that we use the treasury to fund the pieces of the stack of the Cosmos stack. Like the different pieces of technologies that the developers use in order to launch a DAO, launch a blockchain, which for me is a DAO. So anyway, but the thing is that in Cosmos, and it's different with Ethereum, there is not like a central point of leadership. There are different kind of co-founders that they do have influence, but at the end of the day, we don't have one technical leader, for example, that can set up like a sort of roadmap for the Interchain stack. And sometimes that makes it difficult because the community, they don't know what's they don't, like in Ethereum, you can see Vitalik, he comes up with a roadmap, and his research team or a team of developers, they come up with a roadmap for what is Ethereum, and that roadmap includes even the L2s, and people more or less have an idea of what everything is going like in a couple of years. And of course, things can change and whatnot, but like if you go to Cosmos, depending on who are you talking to or what team are you talking to, that's different. And so for the Interchain Foundation, for us, in order to allocate the funds to where it is needed in order to like keep being competitive, it's like sometimes very difficult. So we are trying to set up like a sort of the foundation is put in this place where we have to kind of embody that leadership. Although it's like it feels sometimes like weird because we want to be disconnected a little bit and like be more like on the back stage of things and like funding certain key developments, open and free developments in the Interchain stack. But like we have to come and like put these teams together, these teams that are building the different pieces of the stack, Tendermint or Comet BFT and IBC and Cosmos SDK. And so I do think that leadership, like from a technical perspective, is much needed. And then from non-technical perspective, I think things can be more flexible. And what I mean by that is that, as I said, for me, a DAO is the blockchain, is that system that is closer to a machine than to any type of organization. Now, around that blockchain, there are the humans that are organizing in several groups that can have a specific purpose. And those entities, then they will exercise a specific leadership on a specific domain, and that's okay. I think, but that's more like you could end up with in a specific domain having different type of leaders that are trying to experiment or are trying to do several similar type of goals, like depending on like all these DAOs that we see that are venture DAOs, like the Meta Cartel DAOs. That's very important for the Ethereum ecosystem, these type of things. Or all these DAOs that are like social clubs. In reality, all these called DAOs are legal entities that are sort of their functionalities are augmented by technology, but they are not real decentralized autonomous organizations. However, they are key for the success of those blockchains.
Can I ask a question on that? Sure. What's interesting about maybe Cosmos's approach is kind of like, I would be interested to know what's the selection process on investing in a product like I guess Quicksilver and so on is on Cosmos, I believe. So DeFi liquidity, like staking pool, for example. It's kind of like a fund model that is funding these, I guess, what you mentioned, blockchains. But in the building kind of phases, it feels like it becomes not really chain agnostic, but chain specific. And so does that then create much more creation in silos rather than building blocks of modular building blocks that then impact the entire value chain, if that makes sense? It feels like it's a battle of chains to a degree, but those chains are meeting certain purposes like public goods or DeFi or whatever. But is that then making the ecosystem work more in silo rather than collectively to a degree?
That sometimes is in the ecosystem, people are working more on silos because every blockchain, and the thesis in Cosmos is that every blockchain, every community has its own needs, and so they should solve for that. However, there is one thing that really bring everybody together, which is the IBC protocol, the Intercommunication Blockchain Protocol, and that's the connection point for all these blockchains and all these people to try to communicate among each other and try to make to follow that protocol, so they are able to. The incentive there is financial. And what matters is that in those different independent communities, at the end they are going to be able to exchange assets easily, and so that's the factor that really brings people together. Even with other ecosystems like Ethereum, for example, I want
to maybe have you expand a little bit. So there was Prop 82, the Atom 2.0, proposal, which is essentially, if you want to just expand, what exactly the proposal is and what happened and why that happened.
Yeah, the proposal was around mainly the tokenomics of Atom, improving it, and also around what's the future of the community pool. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Cosmos chains. In Cosmos, if you use the interchain stack, you will end up with a blockchain, but also a community pool. And so that means that part of the inflation of every blockchain goes to a community pool that is governed by all the token holders. And I think the problem with it was amazing, and I still believe in those ideas. But the problem was that a lot of it was many projects condensed in one paper, and the community was totally not confused. They were understanding, but they were it's many projects and many experiments. We cannot just go and accept everything at once, and so it got rejected. However, for me, it was the best result that we could ever have, because it was an example where, some people from the Interchain Foundation, they were involved in that work, but at the end of the day, it was the community decided. There was nothing that the Interchain Foundation could do in order to push that, even if we wanted that to be approved. And so that was a case where the validators really came and they really went and read the documentation, and the community was pronouncing their opinions and whatnot, and it got rejected. So I was super happy. I mean, I was happy and sad because of those ideas. I mean, however, what is happening now is that because it was rejected, now different people are working on all these different ideas and are presenting focalized proposals, like only on one project out of that Atom 2.0. Certain different decentralized and independent teams are working on all these different ideas, which is the best thing for in terms of decentralization. And for us, for the Interchange Foundation, the good thing is that we are able to, to present to regulators examples of like, we are, it's like the Cosmos Hub is really decentralized. We don't control that blockchain.
And I think that's a good example of sometimes when things fail, it's a good learning lesson. Like, I think often we make decisions that are a fear of failure. So there's like overprotection over like making sure it goes through. And that's when I think there's like a lot of behind the scenes that kind of isn't as transparent to people. I wanted to go back to what we were saying around, I just lost it. The leadership. I wanted to hear if there were other examples of failures or like things that happened that didn't work out in your organizations, or that you've seen like in external. I mean, I think Justine, you have put together this collective archives, which you should also talk about. But where are the failure examples that we've seen, and what did we learn from that?
Yeah, there's a bunch. I mean, it's all an experiment, right? So it's not like surprising that stuff is failing. And I wasn't part of this, so I'm not taking credit for myself. But I think the team at Optimism did a great job of setting the expectation from the beginning that we were going to do seasonal experiments. And the community has been surprisingly open to like, that was kind of a mess and we're going to scrap it and start over or try something new. So kudos to the delegates for really being able to recognize like, okay, this thing actually didn't work and we wanted it to, but we have to try something else. I don't know how to point. I mean, I don't want to sound like most of I made these timelines of DAOs, and it's a series of failures basically in most cases, but we are evolving. I think there's like certain best practices or concepts that I think people understand better now. One is this idea of like delegate decision making to people that have expertise. You always want like the highest context people to be making the decisions they have context on. I think you see a lot more of that being incorporated. I think that in the beginning there was like two models of DAOs that we saw, and one was just like anarchic, and the other was like really bureaucratic. Like we just put like a corporation into this structure, right? And I think we're still trying to find the balance between these two things, but at least we understand we need to be between these two things. I'm not specifically. I can talk at Optimism. So we're on the 4th season. So the first season we had all token holders voting on all grant applications. It was like a zoo, basically. It was like delegates had to approve like 36 proposals every 3 weeks. They had no context on what any of these projects were, because they were mostly like projects building in the ecosystem. And the second season, to try to like tame the chaos that was, they wanted to use committees. But these committees were just making recommendations for other delegates to vote based off of. What happened was super interesting, but we had different committees, like the social dynamics deteriorated rapidly. It was very toxic in there for a while. And it was because the committees were like vying for relative legitimacy, because they were all kind of like equal. We had a shadow committee develop. Just like never know what's going to happen. So we had like a DeFi committee that was elected, and then we had like a shadow committee that was like, we're better than the elected committee, right? You're like, okay. So the separation of like being able to recommend versus being able to decide was a negative, led to negative dynamics. And so in the 3rd season, based on that, we were like, okay, committees helped a little bit because it was higher context and it helped with the delegate workload, but we need to pair the ability to make recommendations with the ability to actually decide. And so we have this elected council. So that's just with our grants program, the series of experiments and failures that we've had. I think we're in a decent place right now.
Can I ask a question for this?
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes there's proposals popping up, and then it goes into voting, and suddenly like the core team feels like this is a really bad thing for the project, but the community still votes it through. And sometimes I feel like this is a make or break moment for decentral organizations, how the team responds to that. What are your thoughts on this?
This is actually what I was going to just say next, and it's inspired by your talk at Denver, is that failure is okay as long as you're maintaining the legitimacy of the system, and that like failure is experimentation. Failure is successful experimentation as long as you're not compromising the legitimacy of the system. And so if you look at Justine's archive of DAO dramas and failures, you'll see the difference is that we're all experiencing the same problems, and it's how people maintain their legitimacy of the system. So in these cases, if people pass proposals, like what was like the most recent one that happened? The Aragon one, right? Where Aragon, that whole situation where it was like they
get to a proposal.
What?
They got banned in the forum. It didn't get to
Really? Okay.
Got banned in Discord. It didn't get to the forum.
Yeah. Okay. So it was like something like this, right? And then it was, but it came up, and then it was kind of like a retain of control. And what that is it's saying, well, okay, you wrote out the powers that these stakeholders have. We're executing on these powers, and now we feel like the legitimacy of the system has been compromised because we don't feel like we're actually able to maintain this power, because actually power is seated in other places. And so I think that's, again, just like that's how you classify failures from successes, is if you are constantly and consistently, like what Optimism has been doing. And also, Rad, we've had our share of failures, governance proposals that can't get through because nobody's voting or something. And you're like, well, what do we do now? And it's like you have to kind of figure out how to make sure that you are working within the confines and staying true to the principles of the system, and then you can navigate the failures and kind of continue learning from them, which is what you guys do so well as well, like iteratively designing the system.
No, that's so true, and I go back to the Atom 2.0, and it's so difficult, because we are humans, and at the moment when the vote was on, a lot of people were like, when they were seeing that the proposal was not going to pass, and a lot of people were like sending us messages attacking the Interchain Foundation or the team, like, why are not you're not doing something? And the thing is that even if we really thought that was the best, like I think all those ideas are very good, and it's like at the moment we would go and vote with the tokens that we hold, we would the legitimization of the whole thing, of the whole process, it would have been lost, and that's like a bigger loss than just having one proposal not to pass. You can always present the same proposal again. So yeah, that's super key.
Yeah, so I love this story about Pool Together. Like Leighton's first proposal to the DAO failed. And that's like, I bring this up all the time internally, because that's the like welcome to the DAO moment, right? Where you're like, okay, I'm the founder of this project and the community doesn't want it, and that's the reality of this situation. So when we're talking about putting different things to a vote or different proposals at the foundation, there's always a scenario that we go through, like if this doesn't pass. And some votes we have are it'll be a second vote contingent or a second cycle contingent on the first one, and there's always a plan B for like if it's failed, what happens, because we have to respect the governance outcome.
I guess the question with this is like, when do you change the system? So there was something similar happened at Maker, where there was confusion around what everyone gets confused about, ranked choice voting. And so someone who actually was no longer in the DAO, but had a lot of influence as someone who was priorly like head of it, was like, this was all wrong, like what happened? And the governance facilitator was like, well, this is the process we have, like this passes X, so we have to act upon this Y. We can then put in a new proposal that is or change the system itself, which is kind of those components around it. And I'm curious, as designing governance, thinking about how you're going to think about like, how do you build these organizations? When do you know when to organize, create that change in like the core system versus like, oh, it's just, layering on something?
Defining the process to change the process is like really easy to overlook, and a crisis if you haven't done it when it comes up, for sure. So Optimism, we have this concept of like valid proposal types, and right now there are like 6 or something. When the full governance system is online, it'll be many more than 6. That's the foundation's role, is to like set the system up, and then at that point, like kind of the last proposal type that will come online is like a meta governance type of proposal type, so that the community can change the system. We also have this thing called an operating manual, which outlines what this process is. It's on GitHub, it lives on GitHub, and that's because in the future, like, the people should be able to submit PRs to change that, which you can talk more about, because I think this is how it works at RadWorks.
Yeah, we just did like a big governance improvements proposal, which was like, I think throughout the last year, we've just been version controlling our processes and introducing processes for how to manage those processes, so that you can actually continuously and iteratively improve on the processes. And you don't think about this when you know, I mean, our first governance process, like it was still when like temperature checks were like a thing. Like, you know, we just forked anything that Uniswap was doing. Most DAOs just forked what another DAO was doing and like called it a day. And I think now we've just been like managing and sifting through all like the debt that comes with creating a governance system without kind of intention, you know, and going through and reestablishing all the processes, and then the processes for changing those processes. So the way that I think we've made the decision to be like, okay, now we need to make the change. I mean, first we have like a governance team, like me and Shelby, who's here, are like constantly thinking about how we can improve things. But there's been a couple moments in that we need to reach the next decentralization milestone. We need to evolve our governance in X, Y, and Z ways. And so I think most of our governance iterations have come through understanding what these milestones are, and then understanding where our governance system needs to be in terms of resilience, in terms of security, and in terms of like health and diversity, to make sure that it can support the next evolution of the ecosystem. So right now, we're actually more head down focused on like resilience, right? Which is like, what do we actually need in terms of active voters, votable supply, you know, to actually mitigate the risk, to ensure the long-term viability of the DAO into the future. And so now our conversation has changed from, I mean, right now it's like also how do we empower stakeholders to make the best decisions, which is like a really fun exercise that we're doing, is like mapping decision-making, mapping the stakeholders, and then rethinking our governance mechanisms and figuring out how we can best empower stakeholders to make those decisions the most effectively. But then paired with that, it's saying, okay, you know, we want this pool of funds to live forever and to be able to sustain and fund technologies forever, right? What does it look like to be able to create a very secure and resilient system that can withstand capture, that can withstand collusion, and that can exist as like an actual sovereign first order organization? And that's like way easier said than done, because it's not just about having, you know, X amount of voters a month, you know, it's about really thinking strategically about how to embed that resilience into your governance system, so that it can function, so that when shit goes wrong, you know what button to press, and that everybody who's involved in that governance system knows what they're doing, when and how, and then knows how to exchange power and transfer leadership as well. So I don't think that it's kind of a convoluted answer, but I think it's milestone by milestone. It's not like you just know. I think it's like looking at the milestone and trying to understand, okay, like how do we need to evolve governance to be able to support that next iteration of the ecosystem itself?
Optimism, Radical, and Interchain Foundation, basically the whole treasury of all those DAOs is in the native token, right? Versus like
ours is 50% native token, but then we have like a large stablecoin assets that funds.
Would you diversify?
No, we had stable. When the DAO was instantiated, it had a large stablecoin, like a large section of it was actually just USDC, and then 50% of it is a treasury.
And maybe Optimus is a better example because mainly OP token, and then like Nouns DAO and Aragon, like they have like 200 million ETH and 60 million ETH, which is not this native token, right? Do you think it's an advantage that your DAOs are like mainly as your native token? Because in the other cases, those are all being basically attacked, and so Optimism, no one's trying to attack Optimism. What are they going to take? They're going to take the native token, and then what are they going to do with it, right? So do you think do you look at it as an advantage that it's native tokens versus like if you held that much ETH?
Go ahead.
I don't know. It's tough because it's like there's a lot of disadvantages in the terms of that. If for example, if your treasury is what's funding your development, for example, or it depends on like the purpose of your DAO first. So if your purpose is to fund development, then of course you need to be able to fund development. And there's this whole interplay between like managing token health while ensuring long-term runway. And selling tokens creates downward pressure that has externalities that could negatively impact your ability to maintain both of those. But the advantages, I think anybody's going to attack anything, even if it's a native token or stables. So I think that I don't think it's a more secure system because there's like less of an attack surface. I think it's totally still there. I think that there's just more opportunity actually to utilize your native tokens in a way to empower governance, to create better incentive systems within the ecosystem. So I think that there's like more opportunity. I wouldn't say it's an advantage in my perspective. What do you think?
So the question is, if we have most of the token, most of the treasury in the native.
You guys have it in Atom, the whole treasury that you're giving up.
Yeah, the thing with the interchain is we're not a DAO, we're a foundation, a normal foundation. That's the first thing. And then, most of the, I think half of our treasury is in Atom, and then we have fiat for the operations runway, and then we have Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so, but because we still keep the half of our treasury, or a little bit more than half of our treasury in Atom, we're very criticized within the Cosmos ecosystem because we are the interchain foundation, which is we're not related to one blockchain, and we should not be related to only one blockchain. We have Atom because it was a more like a historical thing. The Cosmos Hub is the first blockchain that launched using the interchain stack. So that's where Atom was connected. Now we have many blockchains, like 50 plus, and we should the treasury should reflect the interchain, like the internet of blockchains, right? And however, I think when you are thinking about treasury management, you really have to be very pragmatic and balance that out with the with the commitment that you have with a certain token, and meaning that certain community, certain use case for a certain blockchain. So you have to, for example, the Ethereum Foundation, they hold also most of their treasury in Ether, and they communicate that as look, we are so committed to this that this is our major the token that we hold the most within the treasury. But at the same time, if Ether, the good thing is that Ether is one of the most strong tokens out there together with Bitcoin. But then the thing is that at the moment of doing treasury management, you really have to be pragmatic in the sense of how you make sure that you maintain that treasury so the project can run for years and years, and I think very important. That's why it's very difficult to answer that as yes or not. It depends on the different cases, but treasury management is tough.
Building on Sky's question, because I guess the real question there is kind of just getting to the attack vectors that come with being able to buy governance instead of earning it. I'm interested to get the panel's take generally on moving away from being able to buy governance and actually designing systems that, I guess, do it based on participation or some kind of meritocratic system, I guess.
Anybody can buy OP, right? But we also distribute a lot of it through RetroPGF, which is people that have built things that are valuable to the system. So in a way, that's a pretty at-scale distribution to people that are participating and building in the space. In the future, the Citizens House and that system will be very based upon attestation. So reputation is going to play a large part of that. 20% of the token supply is reserved for RetroPGF. So I think that is a big element in what we're doing. And then again, this is why the dual house system is important, because if there's an attack vector in the token house, the citizen's house can veto, can step in and block something from happening.
Yeah, for us, I think instead of, again, going and rebuilding the power balance at the base layer, I mean, obviously, like a purely plutocratic system, I feel like that's like baseline at this point. We all kind of agree that it doesn't really function that well. I mean, it's for maybe in specific use cases it does, but for like a non-financial DeFi protocol, you know, it doesn't really make that much sense because of the negative externalities that comes with the hyper-financialization of power distribution. So the way that I think we're mitigating it, because it's definitely something that we want to move away from, is like maintaining the plutocratic system as like the security mechanism. It's battle tested, it works. Have that be like the base layer of how power is distributed, and then just experiment with more complex delegation models that are completely different than this like individual protocol delegate model that we've all kind of like held on to for too long, and start experimenting like what do more complex membership models look like. So kind of, and this comes from like reading a lot about like how the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, functions or does not function, and how people have been trying to fix it, is like building membership networks that have power delegated to them, managing, and then creating a process and a structure around managing that delegation of power that becomes like a hierarchy in a sense, and thinking about how we can empower, you know, a more selected, curated group of stakeholders by delegating them power. And so it's kind of like earning influence, but it's more so if you meet these expectations, follow these rules, and exist and contribute to the ecosystem in this way, then you have these rights and this power. And so creating like again, more localized decision-making centers within our DAO to offset like the plutocratic forces that right now are basically just like inhibiting the system from actually like flourishing and like functioning. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so something that you said, Abby, a few conversations ago was designing governance system with intention.
Mm-hmm.
That's really resonated, but also something that I find very baffling because there's so many unknowns at play, especially from a macro perspective. Because if you think about the DeFi DAOs and protocols, most of them, the tokenomics, the governance mechanisms were designed back for DeFi Summer, where Curve, Aave, all of those things were working well.
Yeah.
And then smaller DAOs have started to copy these mechanisms, but then in today's macro environment, these mechanisms are proving to work less functionally. Mm-hmm. So how can you design governance with intention if there are so many unknowns and you don't know what, one, the tax will look like in a year's time, and two, you don't know what the macroeconomic conditions will look like.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think it's because all people do is like people design a DAO because they want it to be a DAO. They don't design a DAO. So they design a DAO to become a DAO instead of designing their org, for their org. So they're designing for a DAO versus this idea of this DAO that we have instead of designing for an org. So we're like, okay, we need to have this on-chain governance system and it needs to be governed in this way. And actually people just like completely over-design, and like kind of conflate and overstate like the actual decision making that needs to happen within an organization to execute its core functions. And so like when I say designing with intention, it's like really going completely back, like peeling back the layers, which is like what is the actual goals of the system and what is the most effective way to do what we need to do here, and then how do we empower stakeholders to contribute to that decision making in the best way. That's how I would start it if I was designing it a completely new system. But I'm just saying it because like our project has gone through, we've had to pull back the layers so much to go back to even like literally reforming our purpose. Like this whole name change that came, like Radical DAO to RadWorks, came with like so much organizational transition and more so a revisitation of like what our purpose even was, because it sounds so cliche and like so silly. Like why do you need to have like a purpose document? But you actually do, to be able to then say, okay, well, this is our purpose. Like how are we redesigning our governance to be, doing this in like the best way possible, and then build like component by component and designing the components to be iterative and not sticky and not committing yourself to like one way of the world, one token economic model or something. And again, really, this is truly just what I would do differently if we did this all again. There were so many decisions that were made, so many things that were just like forked and applied because it was what everybody else was doing. And truly, most of the governance work has just been going back and like fixing all of these rash decisions that were made and trying to, within the constraints of the system that we've like now found ourselves in, reconstruct a better system more intentionally by focusing on like, what is our purpose now? What are the decisions that we're making? Who are the stakeholders making that? What do they need to make the best decisions? And like and then mapping out the power to ensure that the stakeholders are empowered to make those decisions. So it's kind of just like going through that process at whatever stage you're in.
So are you saying dissolve the core team into the DAO as like whole as possible? Because I see a lot of discussion around like, well, this is the core team and this is the DAO, and like discussion in the core team are as well in private and not being done in public.
Yeah.
Like, what is your take on this?
Oh my gosh, this is like what our lives have been for the last 2 or 3 years, is like trying to figure out how to do that well. Because at the end of the day, it's just all people solving problems with each other and like communicating with each other, right? That's all we're doing. And like, our project has seen so many transitions, and our contributors have gone through fucking hell to keep up with all those transitions. Going from a German GmbH, a company, transitioning from becoming an employee to a contractor. That was the first transition. And then it was like, oh, now I'm not a contractor with the Swiss Foundation. I'm a contractor with the DAO. Can I even do that, you know? And now it's, okay, now I'm a contractor with an independent legal entity that's funded via the DAO, and my funding it's a fucking mess. And it's hell for people to go through, you know? And so the thing that I think we've learned, because we've done a lot of stuff wrong in this, first, like going back to leadership is so incredibly important. It's the only thing that I think like centralized organizations have right, is having like very clear guided leadership of people who have influence is actually kind of necessary to make sure that you can keep making these transitions. But then it's the transition of those leaders, right, into new leaders. So it's how do you say, okay, this is who has power now, right? Like, for example, we had a foundation council which made all decisions on who got funding, got paid how much and everything. And just a couple months ago, we transitioned the responsibilities of that council to the DAO, right? And now distributed that responsibility into processes so that the community can make the decisions that the Foundation Council was making in a transparent and open way, using X, Y, and Z proposal templates, using these accountability mechanisms, and kind of like reconstructing it. And so like the only learning I really have taken is to be really transparent about it, to do it slowly, not all at once, and to be like really intentional about the people who are basically being like impacted by that transition, you know, and kind of like taking people along the way with clear leadership, very open communication, and doing it very slowly, like even more slowly than I think most people would think, to make sure that you can be doing it like intentionally.
But there's only the DAO now. There's no separate.
No, of course there's like, well, so there's like the DAO, right? But now you have the treasury that is governed by token holders. Token holders have the hardcore power at the end of the day, right? It's still, all funding is allocated via token voting. But now you have these things called orgs within the ecosystem. And these orgs represent different groups of people who are building different things in line with the DAO's purpose. And each of these orgs requires funding from the DAO, so they have to submit governance proposals, right? But now you start seeing that there's a new leadership team, right? The org leads, so the people who are leading the orgs, right, in whatever way, who represent, who give the quarterly updates on our community calls, are now leaders in their own sense. And so now there's kind of like a new, power structure in place, but it's a very transparent one. It's open. We know what their powers are. We know what the influence is, and now they're able to start interacting with each other. And now what we're doing is saying, okay, so now we have token holders and we have these org leads, and things are working, kind of, but like what is the new stakeholder group that we want to empower to make sure that these orgs can do their work the most effectively, and how do we empower them through an off-chain governance mechanism to distribute influence to kind of continue like oiling the system. So like now we're in the process of like restructuring how we want more influence to be distributed based off of where we got now. So.
But to your question, I mean, it seems to be a working model that the core team or the dev team can be a service provider to the DAO, right? So like Balancer does this, Board Ghost Development does this at Aave, right? They're essentially like, make a proposal to the DAO, give us funding to ship XYZ technical upgrade thing in the next 12 months, and that seems to work well. They operate much as they operated before, but you can have competition for that, and then the DAO, if they don't execute or the DAO doesn't like what they're doing, the next time they say you don't get funding for that, right? That seems to work like decently well.
So why has no one built a real DAO?
A what? A what? By a real DAO. That's a triggering question. After everything that we just talked about, you're gonna pull out a real DAO?
Conference.
Define real DAO.
Yeah. So all of the things we've been talking about so far is essentially like teams building stuff in Web3, managing the treasury, and trying to do that in a somewhat decentralized way. The things that I've seen that I had like hoped for that DAOs as like concept could really serve, it's these like online or generally like autonomous, decentralized communities of like social movements of people who's like doing things. One example I like is there was a competition to build like a hyperloop, and the team that came up with like the best schema to do this, or like plan, basically won some prize from SpaceX or whatever. And the team that came second on this was a subreddit of just like engineers working in their free time, just like doing something on their own. And like things like Wall Street Bets, or like even like the Pirate Party, when that came around, was just like extremely rapidly is like expansion. And it feels like the things we're doing in DAOs could be an enabler for that type of like social movement, whether it's online or in physical space. So like,
do you mind if I keep this slightly open? Well, you guys are pretty full, maybe not. Okay.
how can we use these tools to like actually enable these types of movements?
That's a great question, and also like with this, your question and your answer, you're touching. I mean, DAOs is like just. I think it's so much a confusing term, and so for example, when you were saying like you were like moving the employees from the foundation to a DAO, but what the heck is a DAO? Mm-hmm. And like in the DAO space, everybody know my DAO, and I set up a DAO, and we set up a DAO, and this DAO, and this other DAO. It's like you're like, and you start asking like what you're calling a DAO, what is that DAO? And when you start asking those questions at the end, it's a multi-sig with a bunch of people. It's not that very innovative, and so that's why DAOs are going to die. We really need to get our shit together. No. But this, I'm going to that point, and so. The thing is that we really need to get our church together in terms of like the DAO identity. I feel like right now we are in such identity crisis for DAOs because anything can be called a DAO. And so, but the real DAOs really exist already. They are not many. Sometimes we are missing the forest for the trees, and like for example, like I said, like Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, that's an amazing DAO. You know, like the fact that you can have a Bitcoin and you can custody that assets on your own and no government. I'm from Colombia. We are very excluded of the financial system. The fact that you can use that thing without asking permission, that's to me is amazing. Now, there are I think there is a very innovative new type of organization that is what most people call today DAOs, which are these multi-sigs, but because we're not working on like what exactly is that type of organization and how can it use smart contracts, for example, how can it automate certain decisions, how can it make more public, more transparent towards the community, and how can really improve the whole blockchain community. I think that's why we are still like, it's like, are DAOs going to die? Or like, what are we doing here? What's a real DAO, right? I think it's because of that. It's more like this confusion of identity of what is it that we are. What are the real things that we are calling DAOs? If you go to those things, they are multi-sig with a bunch of people. They are not transparent. It's very difficult to interact with those different groups. So they are not really decentralized, autonomous, right? But however, I'm not saying that those things are bad. I think those things are you can improve them and use the technology that you have now in order to use all these different type of groups that serve this blockchain, and that you can use this technology that we had at hand, smart contracts multi-sigs, in order to build a new type of entity that never existed before.
But I mean, like, I think there's a bit of a difference here because he's talking about like virtual cognitive niches on the internet, whereas the DAOs that we look at are financialized, right? So when you add a financial layer, you change motivations because you add an extrinsic motivator, which is payment, right? Whereas the types of things where they were just unifying together were more intrinsic belonging type of communities.
Right, but like, is the thing, like, is it binary like choice between those two? Like either it's one big organization with a multi-sig, or it's like a community that doesn't have any money. Like, can we have something in between where we have like many different multi-sigs, like roughly aligned people?
For me, a DAO is, does your vote actually take action? And I'm in like 50 DAOs or more, and almost all of them are actual real DAOs where my vote actually takes action. They're not multi-sigs. And so if your vote, like Uniswap protocol is the example I always use, but that's a protocol that's owned by tokens, 360,000 wallets hold this token. It can turn on a fee, it can start taking money, and the government cannot touch that, and there's no legal entity. And to say that's not a real DAO is not true. And like, if the one problem they have is the token's not that well distributed, right? There's some, like the team and the early investors hold quite a bit of the token, but if that was more distributed, that'd be even better. But that's a real DAO. Every Moloch DAO is a real DAO.
No, but I think we need to. Yeah, I think we need to just nix
the. Not a public company. It's not a company. It's a protocol on Ethereum. I'm not talking about Uniswap Labs. I'm talking about the Uniswap protocol that's governed and owned by the actual token holders.
But see, the problem here is the concept of a real DAO. This term DAO is so shitty because everybody conflates it.
Does your vote matter is all it comes down to.
No, but you could, okay, but then if your vote matters in a centralized, the decentralized governance system where the power is centralized.
If it's centralized, the person can not count your vote.
Yeah, but
my vote on chain matters in a Moloch DAO. No one can stop that.
But by that definition, your vote matters on an LLC.
Someone can stop it.
Who can stop it?
Centralized entity can stop it.
What centralized entity?
The legal system.
The legal system. The legal system, yeah. I mean, actually, I don't want to say this on tape, but the legal system could stop a lot of real DAOs, okay? Just so you know. I don't want to talk about how it could, but just, like, there's ways. And the point is that an actual sovereign first-order organization, like a government, is like, I wouldn't say that any DAOs are on that level yet. I can tell you that, like, for sure, for many different reasons, mainly just being because of how emergent this space is and how fucked up regulation is. We're not even in a space where we can obtain that. I'm not saying that we can't and that some aren't already exhibiting to that, but back to the point is, like, everybody has a different definition of a DAO. Yours is, my vote matters, so that means that it's a DAO.
The protocol DAO cannot be stopped by any government.
No, the protocol, no. But
the DAO is the protocol. Just like Ethereum cannot be stopped by any government. That's a DAO.
That's DAO. I wanna just like give him a chance. He's holding your
But wait, can I just make one more point? Everybody's like, that's a DAO. Guys, everybody has a different definition of it. Let's stop using the word. Go ahead.
Real DAO.
That's a DAO. Oh my God, it's the worst.
Wait, I want to clarify something.
Yeah.
So I want to. It's because.
Finally, sounding very fun.
Yeah.
This is good.
Yeah, I want to clarify one thing. So, because I've been thinking a lot about this, and this is what I'm writing on. I'm writing on, and the way that I think about it is when we say, oh, like I'm working on a startup, and then you have an idea of like, oh, what is in a startup, right? You're like, this it's gonna be like. Like really rapid, like innovative, you're gonna be like growth hacking. Like there's all these connotations of what it is to be building a startup. So when you say that to someone, you're like, cool. And then what's the follow-up question? What kind of startup are you building, right? Because you're saying, oh, I'm gonna do an e-commerce startup. Very different from like I'm building a B2B SaaS product, right? And we haven't quite figured out, like this is the identity crisis back, where it's like we have now these DeFi ones in which we say the protocols are DAOs. There's a clear like, okay, there's the automation, you have a protocol, there's token voting, those they're being developed, and then there's kind of like clubs that you see or like more social, like friends with benefits, etc. Is that a DAO? Is that not a DAO? This kind of thing. But I think what we're really trying to get to and why it's hard is because the value of a DAO is something decentralized. but we don't have like a clear like collective idea of what decentralized means. You can have a decentralized technology, but then the organization is not decentralized. You can say, okay, the way we make decisions decentralized, but actually like technology is like not in any way decentralized. So I think there's nuance here, and that's why like I hear like bits of everyone kind of saying this in it, and we're just not there yet. When you think about how cooperatives have developed, how like legal, like there's a notion around legal entities, and are DAOs like, are we trying to get to the point where DAOs have some entity, like there's a structure that policy can work around it, like a nonprofit. So nonprofit is also an example where I'm like, hey, I'm building a nonprofit. You'd be like, okay, I know that I know it's a public, it's something good for the public that you're building, but there's tons of different structures of publics, and just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean you're not making profit. There's this whole like nuance around that,
The difference with that is that they are regulated, right? They are falling within structures.
Because you create a structure.
Yeah, right.
So when there's an identity, then you create a structure that then over time you can say, okay, there's something like 501c, which is an incentive to participate in a nonprofit. And I think this is where we're trying to get to with this idea of legal entity or something. I just think we're not there yet. And so what we're arguing about is like the identity around that.
The money's in a bank account held by a single legal entity, it's not a DAO. But
oh my God.
He's gonna die on this hill.
Does my vote move money? And no one can stop it.
No, it's like a very...
That's a DAO.
Okay.
But okay, you deserve. He deserves it. And oh yeah, we're gonna be wrapping this up.
Wait, but we had a question.
He's been holding his hand for a really long time.
Yeah, it's fine.
Do you work in Aragon?
Yeah, currently, yes. We will chat after. So I love the fact that you mentioned the dirty word profit, and like I feel like we're dissing on the hyper financialization, but how do we make that into an advantage? Because a lot of governance revolves around giving money away, and then to the example Abby gave of like traditional electrical infrastructure, because nobody was thinking of how do we capture the value, Enron comes in and like fucks everything up. And they actually extract the value, because at the moment, like a lot of the stuff is like, the concept of capturing value is almost dirty. And it's like, if you're doing something valuable and you're not capturing that back into the protocol, at some point you run out of money. And then also it opens the gate for someone else, and we saw that in the internet as we experience it today, someone else comes in and captures all the value that you created. So like, how do we move in that direction, and like what are the implications for governance?
You should. Everybody, like,
I mean,
is doing
this
so
is
well.
this is like the big massive goal, right? This is the optimistic vision, which is to prove this axiom that profit equals impact. And so the idea behind retro PGF is that you evaluate the impact of work that has been done after the fact, because it's easier to understand impact that has been had than potential impact that will be had in the future. And that equation goes both ways. So if the impact you've provided is greater than the profit that you've received, retro PGF should correct for that, and vice versa.
You take money away?
You can take money away, but you can work together as a collective to bargain in a way that you couldn't if you weren't part of the collective.
But like the underlying premise there is like, get more activity on the protocol, so sequencers generate revenue that goes into the pool that funds?
Yeah, so that's like the flywheel part, right? Yeah, so the token house drives growth, which drives sequencer activity, which provides a sustainable avenue of funding for retro PGF. The retro PGF rewards things that are helping the ecosystem grow. You have a sustainability loop there. The way that you're evaluating what gets retro PGF allocated to it is this profit equals impact equation that I'm talking about.
So I would say that it's like really like redesigning profit mechanisms to be disassociated from like the relentless extraction that we've seen. Like, for example, and creating a flywheel. So like right now it's a linear extraction model. It's like people, corporations extract data from users who are using the free internet, giving their data freely, because there was no flywheel that was ever baked in, no user rights that were ever baked in to protect the user from that. And now, for example, in the collective's case, the collective literally has the opportunity to not only design the flywheel, but also design the rights into each user, each chain, into the collective, so to define the rules of the system so that you're actually able to sustainably extract profit while also continuing to build a resilient, like, underlying system. So you create something that's regenerative instead of, it's basically regen, you know? And that's like what I think Optimism is like going to be the first, you know, project to actually demonstrate that at scale.
We're going to try.
No, you're going to. Don't worry. If anybody can, it's you guys. And that's like incredibly important because profit it shouldn't be a dirty word. It's a dirty word because it's associated with relentless extraction. That's it. And if you're able to then redesign the way that you regenerate that value, which we can, that's literally what we've been talking about doing for years with DAOs and all this stuff and tokens, that's actually like the pure potential that we have here. And so it's just more about like, continuing to experiment in that direction and at scale.
Okay, so we're at time.
We're out of time, really?
Right? We were gonna do this 1 hour. We did an hour and a half. Wild. But honestly, I really want to thank everyone in the crowd for this is awesome participation. This is exactly what I was hoping for. Everyone had awesome questions, hot takes, left and right.
I like all down.
Sky's also giving a talk.
I like great. I like all down.